The Pinkertons. They brought law to lawless corners of an expanding nation. The truth about what was next in the real West.
In a past that is now lost forever, there was a time when the land was sacred and the ancient ones were as one with it. A time when only the children of the Great Spirit were here to light their fires in these places with no boundaries. When the forests were as thick as the fur of the winter bear. When a warrior could walk from horizon to horizon on the backs of the buffalo. When the deserts were in bloom and the streams pure as freshly fallen snow. In that time when there were only simple ways, I saw with my heart the conflicts to come. And whether it was to be for good or bad, what was certain was that there would be change.
In order to capture the perpetrators of crime in this immense country, people by every nationality on the globe, it has become necessary to establish large agencies conducted with the most perfect system. Allan Pinkerton, 1875.
Pinkerton detectives had a reputation for being honest and persevering and tenacious, also for ruthlessness. Their founder, Allan Pinkerton himself, spared no means in getting a fugitive, apprehending him and bringing him in. This often meant ignoring any kind of extradition, carrying him across territorial and state boundaries, kidnapping and handcuffing him, knocking him unconscious. The Pinkertons also infiltrated gangs and different organizations in disguises, under aliases. They would go to any lengths to bring their man in, and they thought the end justified the means.
Allan Pinkerton founded his private detective agency in Chicago in 1850. And over the next half century, he and his sons, William and Robert, would try to bring a system of law and order to the untamed frontier. These men and their elite corps of field operatives or agents were hired by the railroad and express companies and the banks of the West to track down and recover money stolen by the many outlaws that plagued this wide open country. In a very short time, the Pinkertons had come to be hated by thieves everywhere.
I know that God will someday deliver Allan Pinkerton into my hands. Just James.
The Pinkerton men who brought these Western criminals to justice became known as cowboy detectives.
In the great rangelands, the vast rangelands of the West, cowboys learned to track and trail, ride like an Indian, and shoot like a Tennessean. These cowboys made natural range detectives.
When the agency moved west, most notably Denver, there was a necessity to have operatives that were cowboys. Charlie Siringo, I think, was one of the most important. Charlie Siringo had been a friend of Billy the Kid, had been a rodeo rider, was a cowboy. One of the reasons he was so valuable was that he was an independent, swashbuckling cowboy. And he prized that independence, and I think he liked being a cowboy detective because he was far from supervision and he could do his own thing.
Charlie Siringo worked for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency for over 20 years. But for most Pinkerton agents, turnover was high.
They're out on the trail for months at a time, eating cold beans and bacon, afraid to build a campfire themselves for fear of smoke revealing their position, far away from home and family. This is a job for young, single, adventurous men.
I think there was a psychological appeal in the case of both of the outlaws and also the undercover Pinkerton agents, and that was simply the spirit of adventure.
The Pinkerton men had very little technological help. Tracking and perseverance were their most important skills.
There's a real game of cat and mouse between Pinkerton detectives and outlaws in the West. They each were expert trackers and trailers. The outlaws knew they'd try to take their horses across rocky country so they'd lose their trails, or ride in stream beds, or double back on themselves, or cross the path of a herd of cattle.
Pinkerton agents had certain advantages over local law enforcement and filled a critical void in federal policing.
There were no federal agencies that moved across state lines to chase bad guys in those days. None. In fact, they didn't come along until 1911. So from 1850 until 1911, federal security or federal policing was literally privatized. So Mr. Pinkerton was the first on the scene, and he filled that niche admirably.
Alan Pinkerton expected tenacity from his agents as much as he required moral character. Yet he demanded results. This struggle between virtue and victory at any cost seemed to define Alan Pinkerton throughout his life.
I feel no power on earth is able to crush me. No power in heaven or hell can influence me when I know I am right. All we have to do is to manage our own affairs with discretion, with honor, and integrity, and we must and we shall win. Alan Pinkerton, 1868.
Alan Pinkerton was born in the slums of Glasgow, Scotland on August 25, 1819. He began working as a cooper's apprentice at an early age and joined a labor organization known as Chartists.
To expand democracy for the working man, but he also wanted order. And therefore, it's hard for me to place him, even though he was in, quote, a radical workers' movement, he seems to have been in it for reasons that later on in America would not seem so radical.
Alan Pinkerton became disillusioned with the lack of personal and economic freedom in Scotland. In 1842, at age 23, he and his young bride immigrated to America.
In my native country, I was free in name, but a slave in fact. I toiled in and out of season, and my labor went to sustain the government. 1861.
Pinkerton and his wife eventually settled outside of Chicago, where he started a mildly profitable cooperage business, until he accidentally stumbled into law enforcement.
He chanced on to a group of counterfeiters whilst looking for some oak trees from which he would make his barrel staves. So when he reported what he had found to the local sheriff, he joined the local sheriff and aided in the capture of these counterfeiters.
The country being new and great sensation scarce, the affair was in everybody's mouth, and I suddenly found myself called upon from every quarter to undertake matters requiring the detective's skill, until I was soon actually forced to relinquish the honorable, though not over-profitable, occupation of a cooper, for that of a professional detective.
In 1850, Pinkerton opened a small detective agency in Chicago. As his reputation for catching thieves spread, he came to the attention of the Midwestern railroads, and a long and profitable relationship began.
One of the most common ways for an express company to lose money was not through train robberies. Train robberies were pretty much unheard of until the 1860s. But instead, their losses occurred through crooked railroad employees, particularly conductors, who would receive a fare and then pocket the money. In order to combat this, Alan Pinkerton would send his operatives onto a railroad train. They'd simply pretend that they were a passenger. They'd pay the fare, and if the fare wasn't turned in at the end of the day, the Pinkertons knew that they had just caught a corrupt conductor.
The first case of this type to go to court was in 1855, when Oscar Caldwell was convicted from testimony given by a Pinkerton undercover agent. From this and other similar cases, Pinkerton was nicknamed the All-Seeing Eye and eventually adopted a left eye as a logo with the motto, "We never sleep."
This became so well known that all private detectives came to be known as private eyes. That's where that term comes from.
For the Pinkerton, it summed up their whole business credo, that we have an eye that's never shut, and it's focused on you, and if you do wrong, that eye is going to pick it up, and your boss is going to know about it. And so you better steer the straight and narrow.
The ability to blend in and appear inconspicuous, whether in the city or out on the range, was of the utmost importance. To this end, Alan Pinkerton pioneered the use of female agents in American private detection.
He wasn't necessarily a feminist. He was just a practical businessman, and he saw that these women could be very effective spies, so he used women for a good, sound business principle. They were effective.
Besides his use of female undercover agents, Alan Pinkerton was a fervent abolitionist and used his own home to assist John Brown and the Underground Railroad. Once again, morality and the law were at odds with each other.
Here's a man whose career is taking off one way, to be a law enforcer, but because in the 1850s a Fugitive Slave Act was enacted, by practicing in the Underground Railroad, he was breaking the law himself. And here was a condition, slavery, that just flew in the face of American democracy as far as he's concerned, so he readily adapted to it.
By 1860, the Pinkerton reputation was growing, and Allen renamed the company the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Soon after, as the Civil War approached, he would be reacquainted with some very influential former business associates.
Mr. Pinkerton was probably lucky in the fact that one of his earliest clients, the Illinois Central Railway, was represented by their general counsel, a young fellow named Abraham Lincoln. And so there was a, if not a friendship, at least a business relationship between the two.
In fact, in February of 1861, Pinkerton agents picked up rumors of a possible assassination attempt on Lincoln by pro-Southern factions as he made his way into Washington, D.C. for his inauguration. Pinkerton caught up to Lincoln in Philadelphia, convinced him the threat was real, and snuck him into the nation's capital on an earlier train. The other former business associate, George McClellan, put Pinkerton in charge of intelligence operations for McClellan's Army of the Potomac once the war had started.
McClellan immediately called Pinkerton and asked him to form an intelligence service for him. After all, what was Pinkerton doing as a spotter? He was spying. Well, it doesn't take much to take spying on employees and translate it into spying on Confederates.
After the war, Pinkerton resumed working for the railroads, and his business continued to expand as the train and express companies grew rapidly. In fact, these companies were entering a new, more violent era, and the Adams Express Company would be the first victim.
Trains now had an express car with the train, and oftentimes hundreds of thousands of dollars in gold and government bonds and cash. Well, these were targets, beginning in 1866 in October with the first train robbery in southern Indiana. The Pinkertons were hired to track down highwaymen who were now preying on trains.
This first band of professional train robbers operated out of Seymour, Indiana, and was known as the Reno Gang, led by Frank, John, William, and Simeon Reno.
They were a major outlaw gang and a major source of efforts by Alan Pinkerton to break up the gang. Following the robbery of a county treasury at Gallatin, Missouri of $22,000, Alan Pinkerton secured enough evidence to pin the crime on John Reno. Pinkerton had sent several operatives into Seymour in an effort to infiltrate the gang. One of them was able to lure John Reno down to the train depot. At the same time, Pinkerton, with 6 very large and muscular men, sprang off a railroad train, grabbed John Reno, bound him hand and foot with rope, and gagged him, dragged him onto the train, and started up and got him into Missouri.
The judge allowed John Reno to stand trial after the very questionable seizure and sentenced him to 40 years hard labor. But the rest of the Reno gang remained busy, robbing trains and banks throughout the Midwest.
Finally, in Iowa, Alan Pinkerton and his detectives caught up with the Renos and actually captured them. They took them into custody and lodged them at a county jail in Iowa. Well, the Pinkertons now left, and perhaps this was a mistake, because evidently local authorities weren't a match for the Reno brothers. Reno brothers tunneled out of the jail on the 1st of April, leaving behind only a note which said, "April Fool."
The Pinkertons continued to chase the outlaws into Minnesota and even Canada. Finally, in the fall of 1868, the 3 remaining Reno brothers and an accomplice were brought back to southern Indiana and lodged in the New Albany jail. The residents of Seymour were anxious to see these villains brought to justice.
Meanwhile, one of the men who had been wounded in one of their robberies, a railroad worker, died. And of course, this set the town on fire. They now formed a vigilance committee and stormed the jail.
A mob broke into the jail, lynched all 4 members of the Reno gang, and left a 5th noose hanging next to the bodies, an empty noose as a warning to anybody who might follow their path.
We now return to the Pinkertons.
The actions of Alan Pinkerton and his agents during the Reno gang case, particularly the virtual kidnapping of John Reno, emphasized once again that when it came to bringing criminals to justice, the Pinkertons believed any means justified the end.
Moralists may question whether this be strictly right, but it is a necessity in the detection of crime, and it's held by the agency that the ends being the accomplishment of justice, they justify the means. Alan Pinkerton, 1867.
This seems to have been very much an ethic that was adhered to by both father and sons. The Pinkertons were accused of brutality, of third-degree methods, of strike-breaking, of injuring people that they tried to arrest, of violating people's privacy rights, and there's probably quite a bit of fact to support those allegations.
The Pinkertons had enjoyed very favorable press from their ability to round up the Reno gang, but that image would come under heavy fire during their pursuit of Jesse James and his gang.
During the early 1870s, the Pinkertons didn't have much success getting close to the James boys. But then in 1874, after the James boys robbed the Iron Mountain Railroad at Gadd's Hill, just south of St. Louis, the Pinkertons decided to try to meet the James boys on their own home turf. It proved to be a mistake for the Pinkertons.
We are rough men and are used to rough ways. Bob Younger.
The Pinkertons didn't realize just how ruthless the James Younger gang could be until two of their agents and a local deputy sheriff were killed near the James Ranch in the span of a single week.
Alan Pinkerton was infuriated. He took these deaths as a personal challenge by the James Younger gang against him.
I know that the James and the Youngers are desperate men, and that when we meet, it must be the death of one or both of us. My blood was spilt, and they must repay. There's no use talking. They must die. Alan Pinkerton, 1874.
In January 1875, a posse of men organized and led by the Pinkertons approached the James farm near Kearney, Missouri. At home was the James brothers' mother, Mrs. Samuels, their stepfather, Dr. Samuels, and their young half-brother, Archie Samuels. The Pinkertons threw into this cabin what they later claimed was a flare. It appears to have been either a smoke bomb or an incendiary device. And Dr. Samuels knocked it with a cane into the fireplace. It was followed by a huge explosion which shattered Mrs. Samuels' arm and killed the young boy. The Pinkertons then fled empty-handed.
There was enormously bad publicity for the Pinkerton Detective Agency, namely that it makes war on women and children, killing a child and grievously injuring a woman. It was the worst possible publicity.
If there is a Robin Hood of the Old West, there also is a Sheriff of Nottingham. And if Jesse James is Robin Hood, Alan Pinkerton is looking like the Sheriff of Nottingham.
Americans had a natural distrust for police detectives. They saw them as spies. That distrust extended to private detectives, and in many ways there was more distrust for private detectives because they were not accountable to anybody except their own private employers.
Alan Pinkerton went to great lengths to combat this dishonest image, including writing many books emphasizing proper detection techniques and structuring his business in ways designed to avoid corruption.
Although the Pinkertons certainly had a ruthless image, they also had an image of being absolutely honest. They worked on a per diem basis plus expenses. They didn't work on a recovery of a portion of loot or any kind of reward basis.
My officers are not accidents, but chosen, salaried associates who have therefore no motive either for dalliance with crime or favoritism to criminals. 1881.
The first famous Pinkerton operative was James McParland, an Irish immigrant. In 1873, he was sent to the Pennsylvania coal fields to infiltrate a labor group known as the Molly Maguires, who were accused of committing terrorist acts against the mine owners.
He was just a genius. He had all the personal characteristics to become a successful spy. He was an habitué of the taverns, and he became very popular. McParland's spying was so successful that a number of the Molly Maguires were charged with murder, convicted, and executed. And that tremendous success with the Molly Maguires was certainly the launching pad of James McParland's career.
For his fine work, McParland was eventually put in charge of the Pinkertons' regional office in Denver, the center for their efforts in the West.
The opening of their Denver office gave them a hub, as it were, to operate out of. And from the Denver office, they sent agents to investigate crimes from Canada to Mexico.
After the train robbery at Wilcox, Wyoming, perpetrated by the Wild Bunch, the Pinkertons were sent to the location on a special train, horses and rifles at the ready, and they set out upon the trail of Butch Cassidy. They were different from the local posses, who would only trail the Wild Bunch to perhaps the county line or a day or two beyond, and then turn back. The Pinkertons didn't give up.
James McParland sent two of his best operatives, Charlie Siringo and W.O. Sayers, to track the Wild Bunch.
It was a frustrating thing for Charlie Siringo because he estimated himself, looking back on it, that in a 4-year period from 1899 to 1903, he traveled 25,000 miles all over the West and even into the Midwest, and most of those miles were hard ones on horseback.
The Pinkertons, for the most part, met with relatively little success in arresting members of the Wild Bunch. In one of their few successes, they managed to trap gang member Lonnie Logan at the ranch of his aunt near Dodson, Missouri. In a gun battle with local officers and Pinkerton detectives, Logan was shot to death.
Harvey Logan vowed revenge on the Pinkerton agent who had shot his brother Lonnie.
Someday I'll have to kill that man. He's very troublesome. Harvey Logan, 1900.
Although the Pinkertons never captured Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch, the relentless pressure they inflicted on the gang did pay off.
The Pinkertons, although they never caught up with Butch Cassidy, put such pressure on him that Cassidy finally decided to give up train robbing, give up bank robbing in the West, and move to a new location, South America.
The tenacious Pinkertons sent an agent, Frank DeMaio, to South America. After years of searching, he finally identified 2 slain Yankees in Bolivia as the famous bandits. The pursuit of the Wild Bunch was the last great outlaw chase for the Pinkerton cowboy detectives, a group of men who felt most comfortable out on the open range.
I know my conscience would not allow me to act as superintendent of the agency in a big city where so much dirty work would be expected of me. I had decided that I would rather remain a sleuth, to do as I pleased when out of sight of my superiors in the office. Charlie Siringo, 1904.
Charlie Siringo was a gifted detective, but he never stopped being a cowboy. He wrote an autobiography about his experiences as a cowboy years before joining the Pinkertons. The title alone reveals the flavor of the book, A Texas Cowboy, 15 years on the hurricane deck of a Spanish pony.
He was a humorous, slender, small man of Irish and Italian ancestry. He was born in Texas, As a young man, only 22 years old, he took part in the manhunt for Billy the Kid in New Mexico. He was a personal friend of Pat Garrett and used Pat Garrett as a reference when he applied for work with the Pinkerton agency.
Siringo's skill on the range provided him with the perfect cover to infiltrate outlaw gangs or trail thieves through small towns without being noticed.
Charlie Siringo and other cowboy detectives operating with the Pinkertons had no problem blending into the frontier West. They knew the country, they knew the lingo, they could operate as a real cowboy or as an outlaw.
Even though Charlie Siringo enjoyed tracking and trailing outlaws, he did have some misgivings about the Pinkertons.
He criticized pretty bitterly many of the shady methods that Pinkertons used to accomplish their objective. But then the bottom line in Siringo's opinion was that, well, maybe the greater good justified all of those sneaky methods that they used.
With all of the agency's faults, I must confess that they do a lot of good work in running down crime for money. Charlie Siringo, 1914.
Another Pinkerton agent, Tom Horn, had little need for moral dilemmas. He didn't care what side of the law he served on, as long as he could do what he did best.
Killing men is my specialty. I look at it as a business proposition, and I think I have a corner on the market. Tom Horn.
Tom Horn was a microcosm of everything that was good and evil in the West. All rolled up into one man. You had a cowboy, a packer, a rodeo star, an Indian scout, a translator, a soldier, a detective, a lawman, an outlaw, a fugitive from justice, and finally a condemned man on the gallows. No novelist could come close to creating a life like the one Tom Horn led.
Tom Horn was a scout for the Army during the Indian Wars and worked for the Pinkertons from roughly 1890 to 1894.
Tom Horn was such a tough character that he finally decided that pursuing outlaws and train robbers was too tame. He drifted up to Wyoming. He hired his gun out to the big cattle interests, and before long he was suspected of dry gulching or bushwhacking suspected cattle thieves. Finally, in 1901, he bushwhacked what he thought was a grown man. It turned out to be the man's son, Willie Nickel, a 15-year-old boy.
By that time, the West was changing, and Horn was abandoned by his former cattle baron friends, eventually taken into custody, tried for the murder of this teenage boy, and hanged.
People still argue today whether or not he was innocent, but there's no question that Horn was a controversial character. Some people like to believe he was all good. Some people like to believe he was all bad. It's clear that he was a mixture of both.
We now return to the Pinkertons.
After Allen Pinkerton's death in 1884, his sons, William and Robert, continued to guide the company.
Robert was much more of a businessman, much more of a bureaucrat, and much more conservative. He was a chip off his father's block. William, on the other hand, had grown up in Chicago under his father's stern rule, and he rebelled. He used to love to go to the saloons. He used to hang out with the criminals. He had quite a reputation. When the agency was taken over by Robert, William they began an expansion program, and offices such as the Denver office and other offices began to open up. They also became much more involved in spying, in organized labor, and got involved in some quite controversial strikes.
The low point for the Pinkertons occurred on July 5th and 6th, 1892, at the Carnegie Steel Mill in Homestead, Pennsylvania, where Pinkerton guards were hired to protect the property. Since the mill was already surrounded by strikers, the guards arrived by barge on the river.
We were told we should use no arms, and if we got a few bricks on the head or rocks thrown at us, that we should not say much about that. Pinkerton Guard, 1892.
The strikers thought they were scabs being brought in to break the strike and opened fire. So there was a big exchange of gunfire in which a number of people on both sides were killed before Pinkerton's bunch surrendered and became prisoners of the strikers.
Homestead became a household word, and it was clear that public opinion was firmly against the Pinkertons in this matter, as illustrated by a ballad written shortly after the conflict.
God help them tonight in the hour of their affliction, praying for him who they'll ne'er see again. Hear the poor orphans tell their sad story. Father was killed by the Pinkerton men. William Delaney, 1892.
The Pinkertons were also involved in labor disputes in the West. Charlie Siringo once again proved his value to the company when he infiltrated a radical miners' labor organization in the Coeur d'Alene, Idaho mines.
He was spending time hanging out in the saloons with the members of the labor union, getting to know their leaders. So in effect, Siringo was compiling a blacklist of those who were in the labor union activists.
Eventually, the situation turned violent when the labor leaders blew up the Frisco mill. Federal troops were called in and the labor leaders were rounded up, thanks to Siringo's blacklist. The bitterness that evolved from the Coeur d'Alene incident came back years later when former Governor Frank Steunenberg, the man who had sent troops to Coeur d'Alene, was assassinated outside of his home in 1905.
The state of Idaho itself called on the Pinkertons, and James McParland, using the detective work of the Pinkerton Agency, eventually traced down Harry Orchard. And Harry Orchard confessed to the assassination of Governor Steunenberg and said that he had done so at the behest of the leaders of the Western Federation of Miners.
The three leaders of this radical labor union, Big Bill Haywood, George Pettibone, and Charles Moyer, were charged. Big Bill Haywood stood trial first, defended by the famous labor lawyer Clarence Darrow. The prosecution was represented by William Borah, who would later become a well-known senator for Idaho for many years.
The legal titans were involved on both sides, and this was a tremendous trial because it seemed to be that the cause of labor itself was on trial in the West. I think the general consensus is that Orchard was indeed the assassin. It's cloudier as to whether or not Haywood and the others were involved, but in any case, it was a great victory for labor and for Darrow and for Haywood because Haywood was found not guilty.
The Pinkertons' involvement in strike breaking certainly tore down much of the positive public image Allan Pinkerton had worked so hard to create. Yet some of the controversial acts attributed to Pinkertons actually involved other companies instead.
In the public mind, Pinkertons had become so famous that all private detectives were Pinkertons. A lot of the Western strike problems were being taken care of by non-Pinkertons who were called Pinkertons.
Such fame was bound to encourage similar tactics from other detective agencies, and even blatant imitation.
The Pinkerton Agency, due to its success, attracted copycats. Among them was a fellow named Matt Pinkerton, who was no relation to Alan Pinkerton. He began his own detective agency simply on the strength of his name. Long-haired Jim Courtright, a lone private detective and a notorious gunfighter in Fort Worth, Texas, appropriated the All-Seeing Eye as the logo of his TIC commercial detective agency.
Some railroad and express companies such as Southern Pacific and Wells Fargo had their own very effective internal detective forces. However, these men only investigated crimes committed against their individual companies. The Pinkertons were the only company to have such a far-reaching effect on so much of the wild frontier.
The Pinkerton Agency was a national agency. In a sense, in the 19th century, the Pinkerton Agency served a role very similar to what the FBI serves in the 20th century.
Mr. Pinkerton developed the first interstate identification system for criminals. And all of those records that were kept by Mr. Pinkerton and his agents from their offices around the country and in Canada were turned over to the first Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Given the technology available to them, given the state of public police at the time, given the disposition of Pinkertons to skirt or even cross the boundaries of lawful activity, they probably were the most effective police officers in existence at the time.
This is the Biography Channel.
You want to be yourself, but you're not allowed to be yourself.
This is the Biography Channel.
I was just beside myself with anger and disappointment.
This is the Biography Channel.
I'm the only actress he knows you have to pay to keep your clothes on.
Reality meets personality, only on the Biography Channel.
Biography Channel. What a concept!